Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this presentation. It's a presentation which is part of the program evaluation course, which is also a part of the TFL and ICT master program of the Ibn Zor University. This course is supervised by Dr. Yusuf Tamir, and I'm going to present this presentation by me, Zakaria Jamaati, and my colleague Aziz Driouche. This presentation, which is entitled The Empirical Evaluation of Language Teaching Materials, is actually based on an article with the same title, written by Rod Ellis, and was published in the well-known academic journal, the ELT journal, and which appeared on volume 51-1 of January 1997. In this presentation, I'll tackle the following points, and as I said, most of these points, or actually all these points, are tackled in the same article. I'll go through a brief introduction in which I'm going to talk about evaluation as a ritual that we tend to do as language teachers, sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously. Second, I'll be talking about evaluation of material, giving an overview of this practice. Number three, I'll talk about evaluating course materials retrospectively, which is a type of evaluation. Then I'll be moving to the ways or different steps of conducting a micro-evaluation of tasks. This is a very key terms in evaluating materials, and I'll be explaining that. And finally, I'll go through a brief conclusions to summarize all the points that I'll be discussing in this presentation. So to start with, whether we want it or not, evaluation is actually a ritual that we do as language teachers every day. Whenever we are preparing for a specific lesson. Now, before we prepare, we tend to find some activities, some materials. So we tend to evaluate that type of materials, whether it is suitable to our learners and also suitable to the type of classes that we are teaching. So, as I say, it is an activity that sometimes we do it consciously, and sometimes while we are teaching, we tend to do it unconsciously, and we decide on the materials we're going to use or we have used based on that. Generally, we have two types of evaluation. So we have what we call predictive evaluation and retrospective evaluation. Predictive evaluation deals about examining any material that we actually plan to use with our students, whereas retrospective evaluation examines the material that has been used, and actually we try to evaluate its effectiveness and whether it has helped us to reach our lesson objectives or not. Generally, the retrospective evaluation, either it is impressionistic or empirical. Now, impressionistic means that we tend to do it based on our impressions about the material that we have used, whereas empirical, it has some guided steps that each language teacher has to follow in order to evaluate a specific task or a specific activity. Usually it's associated with action research. If we go back to material evaluations, it's a very difficult burden for a language teacher. While we tend to prepare, so we need to decide about a certain activity or a certain task and to see whether it is very useful to our learners and to our context or not. So this is what is called predictive evaluation, as I said. Now, after we finish, we tend to evaluate, as I have just said, the material, and thus we fall into what is called retrospective evaluation. Most of the review of literature has focused mainly on predictive evaluation. So most of the articles that has been published usually focused on predictive evaluations. And it is done either by expert reviewers like those journals or academic journals which actually evaluate the materials before they publish it, or it can be on the level of the classroom by teachers with the help of course of checklists, guidelines that are already set by scholars to help the teachers do the predictive evaluation on a systematic way. However, whatever we say about this type of evaluation, so predictive evaluation stays to some extent not reliable, as it does not actually, if I can say, follow the scientific way of evaluation. In this regard, Sheldon has said that it's clear that course book assessment is fundamentally subjective rule of thumb activity. So here we fall into the idea that actually we use our senses and our impressions in order to decide whether this material is effective or unsuitable or not. On the other side, the retrospective evaluation, it's a very important, and to some great extent it's scientifically valid. It provides teacher with information which can be used to determine with material that is used here. And here we talk about the idea that we have used the material and now we are deciding about its effectiveness and whether we need to tweak it and perhaps update it for future use, or sometimes reject it at all and never use it again. Retrospective evaluation can be used to evaluate also the validity of predictive evaluation. So we predict about a certain activity, whether it's going to be useful or not. And when we use it with our class, we tend to evaluate it retrospectively. And based on that, also we evaluate our predictive evaluation. So generally, retrospective evaluation is related to program or project evaluation, and only few published works, as I said, were done on retrospective evaluation. Most of the teachers carry out impressionistic retrospective evaluations. So we have either the impressionistics or the empirical. It's generally based on the enthusiasm we notice on our students and their engagement into the lesson. However, empirical evaluation, which is actually a weakness to the field of research in this regard, is less done by practitioners and less done by scholars. This is mainly because it's time consuming and the information which is collected, it's usually through teachers' reports, on students' journals, and also through surveys, interviews, and questionnaires. Now, the only problem is that for empirical evaluation is that as it mainly was created for program evaluation, we find it very difficult to evaluate the material and the lessons as a whole. So in order to make it very practical and manageable, we tend to resort to dividing what we intend to evaluate into bits, and this is what is called the micro-evaluation. The following is a definition of a macro-evaluations, which is a selection of a particular teaching task by the teacher in which he or she has a special interest and submits it into a detailed empirical evaluation. If we see this definition, there is what we call here, there is a stress on the teaching task. And this is actually a term that started in the last 20 years or the last 30 years in the field of education. But it started first by Prabhu in the task-based approach. Um, and micro-evaluation can stand by itself, so we can either evaluate a specific activity or a specific task, or we can use it as part of a sequence of micro-evaluations that actually lead to the evaluation of the program or the evaluation of the lesson as a whole. In order to conduct the micro-evaluation task, a micro-evaluation of tasks, we need to be aware about the definition of a task, which is a pillar in this type of evaluation. Skihan in 1996 has defined the task as following. It is an activity in which meaning is primary. So here we talk about the meaning, but the creation of meaning. A meaning which is really related to the real world. In this regard, the learner has to complete a task, a meaningful task that has some priority to the learner, and the assessment of the task performance is mainly on the task outcome. So in order to decide whether to assess a task, we assess the objectives, the input, the conditions, the procedures, the outcome, and the processes. So the objectives of the learning task, the input we want the learners to get, and the conditions on which the learning conditions here, on which the learners take the task or do the task, and then the procedures the learners do or go through in order to actually do the task, and the outcome of the task, and later on the processes. In order to evaluate a task, there are some steps that have been set by scholars, and which make this micro-evaluation an empirical one, to some extent very scientific. Now, the first step is to choose the task we need to micro-evaluate. And in this regard, we can have different types of tasks. Now, we need either to try out either new kind of tasks or use tasks that have been used before. So either we experiment with the tasks that the teachers have been using before, and they decide that it's high time to change the input, the conditions, the procedures, and see if the task still actually affect the outcome of the learners. Number two, we need to give a explicit and clear description of the task. This is a very important preliminary sit-in to the planning of the micro-evaluation. So we cannot proceed if we don't actually identify the tasks that we need to evaluate. Number three, we come to the point of planning the evaluation, and here there are many questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to come up with to know exactly what we need to plan in this task. So number one, what's the purpose of the evaluation? Why am I doing this type of evaluation? Number two, who are the audience? Number three, who is the evaluator? Is it the teacher himself, or is it an external evaluator? And then the content of the task, the method that we are using in order to teach the task, and the timing needed for the evaluation. So these need to be planned carefully to make the evaluation go smoothly and without any problems. These questions apply also were mainly set for program evaluation, but also they can be applied to micro evaluation. And in this regard, we can talk about objective model evaluation versus development model evaluation. Now, objective model evaluation deals about evaluating the objectives and discover to what extent the task that we are actually using with our learners has accomplished the objectives we have set before. Whereas the development model evaluations tries to find out how the task might be improved for future use. So the first one deals about whether the objectives we have set for the task actually go hand in hand with the outcome and whether we have reached successfully our objectives. And the development model evaluation deals about to what extent can we improve the task that we can use it for future uses inside the classroom and update it to serve well our learners needs. In this regard, the planning of evaluation should be done concurrently with planning the lesson. So we cannot actually plan the lesson and forget about the steps of evaluation and how are we going to deal with evaluation or the micro evaluation of the task. So while we plan, while we set the objectives, while we think about our learners, we think also about the questions we have discussed before about the audience, about the processes, about the objectives of the evaluation itself. So they actually go in parallel and they are mutually not exclusive to each other. The fourth step, after we finish with the planning, we come to the step of collecting information. And information can be collected either before, during, or after the teaching of the task. So before, during the planning of the task and the planning of the lesson. During, it means while we teach, we tend to actually evaluate how the students engage with the teaching task, and this is through recording what the students do and how the students react towards the activity. And of course, after the teaching task, and this is the point where the teacher need to evaluate task based on different checklists. Many instruments can be used to evaluate and to evaluate the task and to collect the needed information about the micro evaluation. This can range from journals to questionnaires to interviews, and the list actually is not exhaustive. So it depends on our context, on our learning context, and what's the suitable evaluation, or what's the suitable collecting information instrument that might be very beneficial to us. After that, we come to the step of analyzing information. And here we can talk about two ways of analyzing information, either quantitatively, this is through giving numbers and quantifying the data we get and presenting it in terms of charts, tables, etc. Or on the other side, we can qualitatively present the data by actually describing it through narrative descriptions of the information we have collected. The sixth step is where we reach conclusions and we make recommendations. Now, traditionally, conclusions are general statements about what has been discovered actually. So actually in this step, we don't actually give our opinion, but rather we give conclusions on what we found exactly from the data, and then we can give our opinion in the recommendation section, where we actually evaluate the ideas regarding the task we've actually evaluated and give our personal views as a practitioner, and also recommend actions for future or for further research. The last step is writing the report, and this step is actually not needed unless the evaluator, him or herself, decides to share the findings of his evaluation or his micro evaluation publicly. If the evaluator decides to do so, the task of writing the report needs to actually respects the idea of making explicit the procedures that has been followed in order to give the audience or the to understand the strengths and limitation of the evaluation itself. Finally, there has been few attempts to evaluate materials empirically. Thus, there is an urgent need for it. One way to do it is to resort to micro-evaluation, which is actually more practical for the for a very small learning context such as the classroom. More to be gained from formalizing the procedures of carrying out the micro-evaluation. So we can benefit more and more as teachers and as classroom practitioners if actually we follow the scientific or the formalized procedures in order to carry out the evaluation. This this formally guided procedures for micro evaluation can help us pay more attention to the evaluation as we plan our lessons. So it helps us to be more aware about our planning and about the activities we use and about the tasks we select to use with our learners. It helps us go beyond the impressionistic evaluations. So it helps us to be more scientific towards the evaluation. And number three, it's a basis for starting an action research and reflecting about our teaching. And it's a way of developing professionally. Number four, it's a very good way to empower, to self-empower professionally and understand and mainly into understand our classrooms, understands our students, and mainly interpret the classroom events accurately in order to avoid misunderstandings and failures to transfer the knowledge. This is it. Thank you very much, and I hope I was to the point. The following is the reference. Thank you so much.